Historical writer Victoria Manthorpe's recent book takes us into the life of the youngest daughter of famous Victorian author Rider Haggard. But Lilias Rider Haggard had a career and a story of her own to tell. Isn't that right, Victoria? Quite the story as well, really, because she was the youngest daughter of Rider Haggard. But she was an accomplished writer in her own right.
Yes, and in a very different area, because Rider wrote books for adventure stories and romances, which were tremendously popular in his time.
Just reminds a few of those. I mean, they're really big
King
stories.
Solomon's Mines is probably the most well-known, because they were making films of that right up into the 1970s. But She is another one, Alan Quatermain, whole strings of historical romances, Red Eve, which is set near Dunwich. So he used local material as well as quite fanciful Crusader stuff.
And that was something that Lilias was very keen to write about, was local life.
Yes. She looked at things rather differently. She looked around her at what was happening on the farms around her at Ditchingham, and she wrote about the countryside. And it was a very innovative thing to do at that time.
And particularly for a lady as well.
Absolutely. What sort of era are we talking about here then?
Well, she started writing in the 1930s, which is a very interesting time anyway, because politically it's very lively. There are people on the left and the right. There are people going for mechanisation. There are already people wanting organic farming. So there's a lot happening in the countryside, but she wrote right through until the 60s.
And do you think her writing was so popular because it was kind of a look back at nostalgia before those times? And you say people were trying to always move forward. She actually looked back a little bit.
Yes, she did. I think there was a feeling of nostalgia, because it wasn't just the change of an industry. We now have the agribusiness. It was a whole way of life. It was most people's way of life up until they'd moved to the cities. So it was a huge move, and the fact that she collected stories about the countryside, as it had been in the 1880s, which was really the last kind of true feeling of country life, made her quite significant and very popular.
And quite interesting, because she came from a very wealthy background. They were quite privileged, weren't they?
Oh, certainly. They were very well off, because he was so, from his writing, he was so successful.
Was it helpful to her that he was so successful, do you think? Or was she in his shadow to a certain extent?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, certainly the name was a huge help to her. I mean, everybody would have known that name in her time, and would have known really until the generation after the war, because all boys read books by Henry Rider Haggard. It was a well-known thing. But she was in his shadow, there's no doubt. Psychologically, it was a very difficult thing for her to grow up in his shadow and to find her own voice. I think it was extremely difficult.
And to use her own name, because actually a lot of women actually changed their name in those days.
They did. They did. Yeah, or they pretended to be men sometimes as well.
Yes,
but no.
yes.
So why have you got such a fascination with the family?
Well, there are several strands to that, but it all started with Lilias Rider Haggard. It all started with my family. We moved to Canada, and we didn't take very many things with us, but my parents had great nostalgia for Norfolk, because my father's family came from here. And one of the books they took with them was called I Walked by Night, which was a story she mediated. I will call it that. It was not oral history, but it was the next best thing. It was somebody who'd written down their reminiscences, and then she'd edited it and put it together with drawings by Edward Seago, when he was very young. Yeah. So it was a fabulous book. Yes. And that was one of the books my parents took with them to Canada. And so I used to just see it on the shelves. I didn't really know what was in it, but I was fascinated.
Well, it really is a fascinating story. And in fact, interestingly, she was one of the first women ever or perhaps she was the first woman ever to have a regular column.
She was certainly one of the first. I mean, we're quite strong on that in Norfolk. We've got Harriet Martineau back in the 19th century, who was one of the first women journalists. So we got a good strong tradition.
He was one of the first women journalists, I think you said there. She was one of the first.
Sorry,
that's quite right. No, you're confusing me now.
No, Harriet Martineau was one of the first women journalists. But as a columnist, this was a new thing in newspapers. What the editors had woken up to suddenly in the 1930s was that women were reading newspapers. And if women were reading newspapers, then they needed women to write for them to cover their interests. And so Lilias was commissioned very, very early. Early 30s.
So these were a big part of your life. These stories, you took them away to Canada. So you're now rewriting them. You're bringing them out yourself. So where can people get them from?
The columns are actually being reprinted in the Eastern Daily Press on Saturdays, and they have been for some months now, so that's a very good place to start. And then the book itself, which is the story of her life, is published by Poppyland, and we've just brought out a reprint. So Poppyland Press, you can find that online, or in local bookshops.
All good bookshops,
All
as they
good
say.
bookshops.
And some
Lovely.
rubbish ones as well,
And
probably.
probably.
And
yeah,
Amazon.
Yeah. And, well, it's a terrific book and a great story, and well done.
Thank you very much.
Nice
Thanks
to
for
see
coming
you.
in. Lovely.
Thank you. Well, now this week we were hoping to say.